everyone, and thank you for signing on to our webinar today, Hostile Events, Preparing Your Emergency Services Organization for an ASHER Incident. I'm Caroline Stakowiak with the National Volunteer Fire Council. I will be moderating today. I'd also like to thank our partner on this project, the International Association of Fire Chiefs, for helping to develop this webinar, and be on the panelist side with you today. I'll just mention before we get started that this webinar is being recorded. We will have it available on our virtual classroom, and I can put that link in the chat box for you all. We will also have a quick Q&A session following the presentation. Feel free to submit your questions at any time in the chat feature or the Q&A box, and I'll keep track of those. So for anyone who's unfamiliar with the NVFC, we are the leading nonprofit membership association representing the interests of volunteer fire, rescue, and EMS services. We serve as the voice of the volunteer in the national arena and provide invaluable resources for our first responders. If you are not an NVFC member, you can join today. It's just $18 a year. Our member benefits include a $10,000 AD&D insurance policy, free online training through our virtual classrooms, and Target Solutions, which is an online platform for operational courses, access to the member community, volunteer voices, educational discounts, online universities, and fire service trainings, eligibility for special programs such as our Globe Gear giveaway and educational scholarship, and of course our webinars, which are available for free to both members and non-members to support the fire service. You can learn more at mvfc.org/join. And I'd like to do a quick overview of our partner agency on this webinar, IAFC, which represents the leadership of firefighters and emergency responders worldwide. Their members are the world's leading experts in firefighting, emergency medical services, terrorism response, hazardous material spills, excuse me, natural disasters, search and rescue, and public safety policy. For more information, you can visit IAFC.org. And now I'm happy to introduce our panelists for today's webinar. Our first panelist is Tom Miller. Tom is a 35-year veteran with the Sissonville Volunteer Fire Department in West Virginia. He has served on the NFC board since 2008. He represents the NVFC on the NFPA 470 Technical Committee and the NFPA Joint 1001 472 Task Group. Tom is active in the West Virginia State Firemen's Association and currently serves as its scholarship chair. In his paying job, Tom is employed as the Privacy and Security Officer for the West Virginia Department of Administration. Our next panelist is David Hall. David is the Director of University Safety at Missouri State University in Springfield. He retired as Fire Chief from the Springfield, Missouri Fire Department, where he served for 28 years, and prior to that served as a volunteer firefighter for 7 years. David serves on the IAFC Terrorism and Homeland Security Committee and was the IAFC representative for the Technical Committee for NFPA 3000 Provisional Division. And last but certainly not least, we have Kevin McGee. Kevin is a 40-year veteran of the fire service, which includes 11 years as Chief of the Prince William County Department of Fire and Rescue, and is currently the Executive Officer of the IAFC CEO. Chief McGee is the Chief of the IAFC Terrorism and Homeland Security Committee, and he holds a Master of Public Administration from George Mason University. And with that, I will give it over to you all to begin the presentation.
Want to welcome everybody to the ASHER ASHER overview. Next slide there, Carolyn. You need to understand that ASHER incidents are active shooter hostile event. And you put the R on for the response, which is what we're going to talk about today. And response is a comprehensive approach that includes preparing for these types of events, mitigating the actual incident response, and recovery from. So we're going to cover all of those topics today. Next slide, Carolyn. These incidents can arise from a host of different origins. Many times they are lone wolf actors who are driven by everything from a personnel issue, like a domestic violence issue, a disgruntled employee issue, like what happened in the Walmart shooting, to people with severe mental health problems, for example, the Colorado theater shooter, people who are suffering from delusions or paranoia or psychoactive drug use. They can also be attached to political ideology, to religious or other factors. But what's important is that you never underestimate the threat. Someone who may appear non-lethal may actually be very, very motivated in their efforts to kill. Second type is terrorist type cells, and they can be part of a much broader attack. They can be isolated incidents by a lone wolf actor, or they can be part of a much wider attack. And lastly, there's social and political unrest, and we've all seen that lately with incidents going around the country. And those can be driven by a lot of, right wing, left wing. There's no different things. Militia groups, eco terrorists, or other people can perpetrate these types of incidents. Next slide. Brief history. You got to understand there was the Texas Tower incident back in the 1960s, which really brought everyone's attention to it. Then, even though Columbine was not the first school shooting incident, it's the one that was on all the news. And, you think of it, if someone just uses the word Columbine, it automatically attaches people back to a specific event. And then the horrific events at Virginia Tech with 31 people killed, and the Pulse nightclub in Florida, which had a high death rate, and the Route 91 Harvest Festival in Nevada, where over 700 people were wounded or killed. And of course, the First Baptist Church incident in Texas. They've been around for a long time. There are certain studies out there that say they've been around even longer than that. It's just they weren't effectively tracked. So there's been a lot more attention to them. They've been brought more and more to the forefront. Next slide. Here's a breakdown. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about it, but you can take a look at the numbers and the statistics that are attached. And this goes from most lethal, not necessarily most people shot, but most deadly, down to it's the top 22. And you can see it varies, but you'll notice that most of them are in the 2000s, with the exception of the Edmond Post Office in Oklahoma and a couple other incidents. Most of these are from 2000 and up. When you look at the statistics, I'm going to turn that over to Kevin, my partner Kevin Hall here on the panel, and he's going to take off on it.
I needed to unmute. Well, thank you, everybody. I'm Kevin McGee. I'm going to go over some of the statistics related to active shooter and hostile events with you. This is an important process to go through in your assessment process for your own program in your local area. So in the United States, from the year 2000 through 2018, there was 277 active shooter incidents that involved 2,430 casualties, 884 of which resulted in fatalities. You can see over on the outline of the United States, the map of the United States that shows where incidents occurred and by the volume per state. It's pretty well distributed across the country. There's no state, of course, that's immune. Some states that have higher numbers, there may be a relationship to the size of the state and the population and population density in that country. So next slide. So in 2019, there was 28 active shooter incidents. And based on FBI statistics, characteristics of the shooters included 26 who acted alone. And this is the predominant case that we've been seeing over the last 20 years or so. Predominantly male, 28 were male, 1 female. And then you can see the distribution of number of cases by age levels. It sort of dwindles off with as we go up each decade of life. 9 shooters were killed by law enforcement and 5 committed suicide. Many of these incidents, the majority of the incidents are over quite quickly. And as you can see in the case of 2019, that 14 of which resulted in the death of the attacker. Next slide. This slide shows the distribution of active shooter incidents by year. And you can see the troubling trend that's occurring with the escalation in the number of cases per year. This is important for us to keep in mind because it wasn't too long ago, and I would say prior to the year 2000, that preparing for active shooter incident was not in the mission of the fire service. But now it is. And with everything that's on our plate in the provision of the wide range of services that we conduct now, we also have to be able to carve out enough of our resources to include our time to prepare for an active shooter incident or hostile event that occurs in our own community. And there's no indication that this trend line is going to flatten or decline in any way. Next slide. Next, we can see the active shooter casualties per year, and you can see the escalation that has occurred since the year 2000, with 2017 really standing out. Is there anybody that can quickly access their chat to identify what occurred in 2017 that may have accounted for that big spike in 2017? I'll give you a second to respond. Okay. Everybody is right on target. It was the Las Vegas Strip shooting that resulted in 58 deaths and 489 wounded. But also that year, and I didn't see anybody identify the First Baptist Church shooting, which this was a rural community in Sugar Land, Texas, that resulted in 26 people killed and 20 people wounded. Next slide. And this chart shows the same thing, the number of casualties, but it breaks down the number of fatalities to the number of wounded. An important role that we're going to play is in stop the dying. So even if there's an escalation in the number of these types of incidents in the future, a very important role that we play is to be able to interact with law enforcement, public safety communications, to intervene, to stop the bleeding, to stop the dying, to rapidly transport to the appropriate medical facility, which would be a trauma center for definitive care. So hopefully with the interest that you have in this program and the interest that you have in preparing your organization and your community for these kind of incidents, that we can reduce the number of fatalities, even and along with law enforcement, reduce the number of total casualties. Next slide. So this shows, this slide shows the number of active shooter incidents by locations. Bottom line here is that an active shooter incident can occur anywhere, especially where there are vulnerabilities. And there are plenty of vulnerabilities in commerce and education, open spaces. Government agencies are often a target. But again, they can occur anywhere. Just a mile from my office while I was chief in Prince William County, there was a domestic incident that police department responded to and quickly followed up with response from my department as the police officers approached the home, knocked down the door. The perpetrator, who had a semi-automatic rifle, opened the door, popped out from behind the door, and began shooting at the police, killing one officer who, it was her, the first incident, the first call that she went on as a police officer. And another police officer was seriously wounded, but his life was saved because of the stop the bleed intervention from fellow police officers, quick interaction by EMS, and rapid transport to the closest trauma center. The police officer who was mortally wounded died at the hospital, and her wounds were not able to sustain life. I also responded to an active shooter incident at a community college where the individual got a poor grade or a failing grade in his English class, walked into the classroom and began shooting with his high-powered rifle, and the gun jammed, and fortunately he was subdued and there were no injuries. He missed everybody with the amount of anxiety and adrenaline that was pumping through his system. So they can occur anywhere, and we need to be prepared to respond no matter where the incident is. Next slide, please. You can see here that the vast majority of the active shooters are male and the white males. But again, there's nobody that's immune, no population group that is immune from the stressors that we're going to look at next. We're all human, so the active shooters across the entire spectrum of our population, but again, predominantly white males. Next slide. So you can see the preponderance of stressors that have initiated active shooter incidents range from drug alcohol abuse, marital problems, conflicts with others, job-related stressors, financial strain, and the number one major stressor is mental health issues. So what are we dealing with right now that can exacerbate these group of stressors that might be putting us at a higher risk? What kind of conditions are we looking at right now in our society? And you can give your thoughts on the chat. Okay, COVID, absolutely. COVID and the elections. And these are two issues that the Terrorism Homeland Security Committee has been looking at, providing products for the fire service. And I'll mention those a little bit later. So we do need to be on special alert and preparedness for the kinds of stressors that our society is experiencing right now for the potential of active shooter events. Next slide.
So one of the things we want to talk about is how is it we protect our own. Next slide, please. So unfortunately, what we've seen, so we tend to think of active shooter hostile events where that others are in our community are involved in those. And we know those typically end fairly quickly, as Chief McGee had said a few minutes ago. But we are now seeing something that's really a change for many of us within the fire service, in that we've become the targets as well. Whereas historically we were considered the good guys, so to speak, and we could go into an area where that there was maybe hostilities towards law enforcement, and we can no longer do that and do that safely, because we become seen as either part of law enforcement or associated or affiliated with law enforcement, but also the government in general, as we're viewed as that. So we really have to look at that, how that impacts us. Let's go to the next slide, please. So here's a specific incident, happened to be in West Webster, New York. Some of you may have been familiar with that. This is a few years ago, and certainly there's cases since then, but an individual set his house and his car on fire and then lay in wait across the street. And whenever firefighters arrived, he shot and killed 2 of them and injured 2 more. And whenever law enforcement arrived trying to rescue the firefighters, they were shot at as well. Ultimately, as many of these end, they found him sometime later of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. But it was after, again, the casualties with the firefighters, as well as the loss of 7 houses. And then also ultimately, as his sister was found inside the home as well, and which seemed to be a precipitating factor for this, is what we see on many of these. Speaking personally, I know I've had a couple of incidents here in our community, and we're not that large of a community, only about 170,000, but we've had some of those where that firefighters were shot at, where that somebody's been barricaded themselves within their home and then typically have set the house on fire as a result of that. So it's one of those we have to be prepared for, and certainly caused us to relook at our policy and our coordination with law enforcement, our personal protective equipment, as well as our standard operating procedures to go with that. So one of the most important things we can do is we've got to conduct a risk assessment. I know I got my start in the fire service in a very small rural community, and our risk there, well, we would look at that and saying, oh, we don't have to worry about that happening here. If you look at the statistics, we know that can happen anywhere. It can be small communities, large communities, and we have to look at what our threats are, and we have to take appropriate actions. Many of these, we're responding to medical emergencies, whether you're a community of 300 or whether you're a community of 3 million, we're responding to these calls and we need to be prepared. So the first thing we do is we do a risk assessment, and then making sure that we're really putting in that situational awareness piece. We're really good about that with the fire service, with fires. First thing we do is we do our initial size up. That's the situational awareness. We think about those things. We tend not to be as good about that whenever we're going to a medical emergency. We may do that if we are responding to civil unrest. But again, whenever it's just that one-off, maybe it's even a heart attack, and we go to that, like what we saw in one of the suburbs there in Atlanta, where 4 firefighters were taken hostage as part of that. So next slide, please. So some of the things we can do. So, you want to look for some of your takeaways from the presentation today. Here's one of those slides, is train your members in ASHER events. What are those potentials that you have? And I think as what's previously been presented by Tom and Kevin is it can occur for a variety of reasons in a variety of locations and in a variety of means. So we need to be prepared for that. Develop your SOGs as part of that. Chief McGee already talked about the stop the bleed. It's really one of those critical things that we can do to truly save lives in these type of events, and frankly is in many other types of situations as well. So having their low cost is something that you can do really for a public relations standpoint from your fire department, and giving that to the public as well as for your own firefighter personnel. And things such as we're doing station design. Again, in the past, we've tended to wanted them very open, and not that, I'm not a believer in closing down fire stations and making them secure facilities any more than what's necessary. But as we, see in locations such as what we had with the Pulse nightclub, which was very nearby, and people were coming to the stations, you want to be able to secure your facility. So things like laminated film on it, the use of, just simple security cameras. And then I go back to kind of that comment about whenever we're doing situational awareness, is if something doesn't feel right, we need to train our members to make sure that they know is they need to get out of that situation. We hear that over and over and over, where someone says this, it just didn't feel right. They didn't necessarily know why, but before things went bad, it just didn't feel right. And then, what we've really found through this with these type of events is it's the recovery phase is really significant. There's a lot to go with that. So planning for critical incident stress. Many of us will have developed an SOG or a procedure if we have a line of duty death, and we can pull those plans, we can adapt those and be able to utilize for these same type situations with some minor modifications. So one of the things is I was very fortunate is that I got to serve on the NFPA technical committee as we developed this standard, the provisional standard. You can go ahead and go to the next one. If you're not familiar with that document, I would encourage you, you should get a copy of that. So the standard for active shooter hostile event response, just so you understand kind of what the process is, and then I'll talk about why NFPA here in just a second, is the first thing that occurs is a request from the public. And this was a result of Chief Droz in Orange County, Florida, after the Pulse nightclub shooting. And he said, something has got to be done. We need something to do better than this as our communities, and had submitted a request for consideration that gets put out on a survey. 97% of the input was positive that we should create a standard, or that NFPA should create a standard. And it had the most applications ever received for a technical committee. And I think that shows the level of interest in that. They created a broad, balanced technical committee. I was surprised by that. I think there was 53 members at that point, representing a cross-section of many national organizations from, of course, fire, EMS, law enforcement, from every level of government, higher ed, hospitals, physicians, private sector. It was really a broad breadth, career, volunteer. It was a broad breadth, and it was not about the fire service. We were just one small part of that. And as part of that, we saw active shooter events that were occurring while we were working on this very standard. So whenever we saw the Sutherland Springs shooting and we saw the Las Vegas shooting occur while we were working on this, and at times when we were actually having our committee meetings. And so we knew the importance of getting this out. Typically, because it is such a collaborative process, it takes time. And in order to go through that process, because it is a consensus building process, and so it was fast-tracked. Only one other standard has ever gone through that process because of the sense of urgency. It was put out as a provisional standard, and then now it's gone through the revision cycle to where it's gone through a full vetting and a full release on a regular, what we'd consider a normal standard process. So many people ask us, why the NFPA? Certainly my police chief did. He said, well, that doesn't apply to us. That's the fire service. But if you understand what the NFPA is, it's a standards process making organization, and it's about building consensus. So this is the same process. It's accredited, and that's what occurred with this. There were other organizations, frankly, that could have taken this up and worked to create a national standard for it, but NFPA was the one who really stepped up and said, let's get this moving. Next slide. So you can see here as an example of the, some of those within that have fire service ties. We certainly organized labor was very involved in that. IAFC, National Volunteer Fire Council, FEMA, Homeland Security, USFA, all the lists that you're going to see are involved in that. But, frankly, as this was just a small part of the overall group that was part of this. The one thing I would say is, because again, I think you've got to, as the fire chief, you've got to work with your local law enforcement and elected officials and others, and really developing is, because their first thought is that's NFPA, that doesn't apply to us. But this applies to community leaders, emergency management, who are also involved in that process. This is designed for the public, whether, it's your local pastor or your hospital administrator, really, it just, the general public, the mom, the parents that want to know more about their schools, it applies to all of those because it is such a broad breadth of standard, and it's not focused strictly on response, and it's not focused strictly on the fire service. So the one thing, and I was certainly impressed with this, is we came away, whenever you look through all the standard, there's different chapters and sections that it's got, the 4 overriding themes that we really focused on is it's a whole community approach. Active shooter incidents do not limit themselves to law enforcement and they're done, wash their hands of it, and then that's at the end of it. It's a whole community approach. The other thing that we saw over and over and over in virtually every after action report you see after an active shooter hostile event is the lack of a unified command that's co-located in the same physical location and that's not physically separated. That is what it takes in order to make these highly effective. That you've pre-planned your recovery process. There is so much to that. And frankly, I think it's probably one of our strongest chapters in the entire document is the planned recovery. We had some really good experts involved with that and being able to share that. And then the last one is, it kind of goes towards that community, whole community it's about an integrated response, things such as rescue task forces and how we work with our law enforcement partners, our EMS partners, and emergency management and others, facility operators, in being able to respond. So that's the reason, and that's the 4 guiding ones. I really do encourage you, if you've not taken a look at that, to get that. It's a really good document to be able to assist communities as they prepare for these types of situations. And it applies whether you're a very small community to a very large community.
Okay, I just need to find the unmute button. So I'll discuss with you the prevention and preparedness portion and relating that to the IFC's Terrorism and Homeland Security Committee's toolkit. So first, to tell you a little bit about the Terrorism and Homeland Security Committee, we identified terrorism and homeland security issues for IFC advocacy. We're a resource on homeland security issues, and we foster and maintain crucial relationships with homeland security leaders. That includes Congress, the White House, and federal agencies. So we're engaged in helping Congress craft national legislation and policies to protect the public. If you're not a member of the IFC, I strongly encourage you to consider applying. There's a tremendous amount of resources, and just from the Terrorism and Homeland Security Committee, we put out a significant amount of products, some of which are very timely, as valuable to the National Fire Service, if you know about it and make use of it. We spend a good deal of our effort capturing best practices and lessons learned to share with the National Fire Service. And to give you a few examples, Chief Castle, who is a member of our committee, is the past chief of Clark County, and he was chief during the Las Vegas strip shooting. And with the support of his community and the encouragement of the Terrorism Homeland Security Committee, he has been across the country giving briefings on lessons that his department, his response agency learned from that experience. We also have created several U.S. delegations, and I'm just thrilled that we have at least several international participants on the webinar today. Um, uh, Several of our members went to the United Kingdom to learn from the complex coordinated terrorist attacks that occurred there, as well as a delegation to Paris to learn of the complex coordinated terrorist attacks that occurred in Paris. To bring back, and that we shared in presentations across the country, to include the Fire Rescue International Conference, as well as articles that we prepared and distributed both nationally and at the local level. As you heard from Chief Hall, we are engaged in the standards making process, and NFPA 3000 is a prime example. But we're also engaged with other organizations to do program advisory and to include course advisory for some as well. Building relationships with partners is so important for you at the local level, and we emulate that at the Terrorism Homeland Security level as well, having a cross section of representation from the National Fire Service as well as Canada. We have liaisons on our committee from the FBI, critical infrastructure, education, for which Chief Hall is now representing, research, state, homeland security, and international. Our international liaison rep is he's a member of the Paris Fire Brigade, but he's a former war journalist who was captured by ISIS and held hostage for over a year. And he learned a great deal about the psyche of ISIS and has been sharing that broadly with the Fire Service. National Counterterrorism Center, Joint Counterterrorism Assessment Team, or JCAT, created a toolbox for issues and risks that emerge from incidents that they analyze, put out a toolkit to the National Fire Service for our awareness to be better prepared. And we engage with NCTC and have been pushing for JCAT representation, Fire Service representation at the JCAT. Currently, we're looking for another representative to go in there to represent the Fire Service. Strongly encourage you to engage in your intelligence community. The IFC has produced, the Terrorism Homeland Security Committee has produced an intelligence guide for fire chiefs that you should familiarize yourself with, because we should be both the users of intelligence as well as the contributors to intelligence. One of which is every fire department in this country should have suspicious activity reporting policies. And that is giving input to, it's similar to the See Something, Say Something campaign, that if we see something that's out of line while we're engaged in an incident or out in the community, that we are able to inject that into the intelligence fusion centers, and that can work its way up into the Joint Terrorism Task Force. There's 56 FBI field offices around the country. and we're working to have a fire service representative in each one of those. Currently, we have either 7 or 8 FBI field officers that has fire service representation in the JCAT. I mentioned the suspicious activity reporting. We have a model policy on the IFC website. In the Terrorism Homeland Security Committee webpage that we encourage you to take a look at and to apply to your jurisdiction, either to do an update or if you don't have a current policy to initiate one. Next slide, please. And Chief Hall mentioned integrated response. We're actively involved in making sure that the resources are there for integrated response training that would involve law enforcement, EMS, and public safety answering points. We've established a professional partnership with an organization called ALERT. It's the Advanced Law Enforcement Rapid Response Training. They're a research-based active shooter training program that does integrated training. The Terrorism and Homeland Security Committee is working closely with them on areas for research that will be of value to the fire service. We're engaged in vetting their training the trainer courses. This is training that is free to any community. If you can get your law enforcement, EMS, and the fire service together, make a request for ALERT to provide a train the trainer course to get you started to be able to train every first responder in your community. That is of critical importance. I'd also encourage you to reach out to the U.S. Secret Service National Threat Assessment Center, and you're likely to need to do that with other agencies, specifically to include law enforcement. They go around the country giving briefings on the current threat assessment in the country that is a much deeper dive than what we're doing here today. It's probably about a 3-hour session that will give you a very thorough overview of what the threat assessment is in the nation that you can apply to your community. And then there's the Rural Domestic Preparedness Consortium for all the jurisdictions in the country, but particularly the rural jurisdictions. I would encourage you to take a look at the crisis management for school-based incidents, partnering law enforcement, first responders, and local school systems to be prepared for active shooter incidents that may occur in the school. The IAFC Terrorism Homeland Security Committee has an active shooter toolbox that is really designed to be a one-stop shop for the most current literature and guidance for your development of your standard operating procedures and standard operating guides for these types of incidents. The most recent product that the Terrorism and Homeland Security Committee has included is an active shooter response checklist. This is something that every chief's vehicle should carry. It is a checklist of things that the incident commander and responding chief officers should go through to keep in mind, to think through in those initial stages of these incidents that are very resource intensive, stressful, and often quickly resolved, but require tremendous amount of attention while the incident is occurring. So that is available to all fire departments in the country. Next slide. So our collective mission for active shooter and hostile events incidents is to stop the killing, stop the dying, and start the healing. The role that we play in the fire service, emergency medical services from Stop the Killing really involves being involved in the intelligence community. And the best hostile event incident that we could respond to is one that has been prevented, where law enforcement has intervened and stopped the plot before it occurred. There are a number of incidents that have been stopped as a result of information that was provided by the fire service. One of which that I'm familiar with has occurred in Prince William County. Then we have a role to stop the dying and stop the bleeding and start and rapid transport to the appropriate medical facility. Every second counts. And so we have to be engaged and integrated into the with law enforcement into the warm zone to be able to extricate victims and get treatment initiated and rapid transport. And then the start the healing process is how we get through the psychological impact. And terrorists, their objective is more than just killing those people, but to create terror within the community. And we learned a great deal of that about how to handle that from the delegations that we sent to Paris and to the United Kingdom. As Chief Hall mentioned, incidents can occur anywhere. And so prepare your own businesses if you're volunteers or you have businesses that you're involved in on the side, as well as your fire departments for the risk of an active shooter who may target you and your workplace. I would specifically ask that and recommend that you take a look at the IFC webpage. There was one chat that mentioned civil unrest. We had just put out Friday an updated guide for fire departments, and it's titled Response Considerations in Incidents Involving Crowds Following the 2020 National Election period. So this will address the role that fire departments have and what fire departments should be considering and planning for right now for the potential of civil unrest or some terrorist attack related to the national election. So with that, I'll turn it to the next presenter.
We're going to talk now about prevention and preparation threat assessments. And go to the next slide. The first thing that you have to look at when you're conducting a threat assessment, just like any risk-based emergency management is what do you have? So starting off is what sites could be potential targets in your area or in your region. And we've got some of them listed here on the slide. I won't go into them in detail. And then you look at, what are your resources? Are there any do you have specific threats? Do you have credible information? And you want to look at access and egress points. You want to look at lockdown and surveillance procedures. You want to know, are there places of haven within that church or within that school that can be fortified and defended? And you want to work all of that into your threat assessment. Next slide. So you want to look at the community threat level. And for example, Kevin brought up civil unrest and political. That can change very rapidly. It can change with an event that happens in the news. It can change because of some isolated incident that may be extraneously attached to foment that civic unrest. What is your personnel threat level? What have you done to protect your members? Do you have ballistic armor that your firefighters and EMS personnel can wear? Do you have no response procedures for not entering hot zones of civil unrest? What kind of efforts do you do to protect your personnel? Look at your physical facility. what are your blind spots? What are your vulnerabilities? Do you have door locks? Which rolls into the next one. Do you have open door policies? Do you take your fire station, open up the bay doors and let just people walk in? As we've seen from some incidents around the country, the primary actor wants to take out first responders. So having these kind of policies can actually be a huge liability. What is your street profile? Can someone drive by your station like they did in West Virginia and crack shots off into the bays, through the doors, into the apparatus, or where firefighters could be sitting? So you want to take a look at things like that. And again, what are your SOPs and SOGs, and are they based on sound policy such as that developed by the IAFC? Next slide. Who are your partners? Who do you want to be on your team? You know, there's the we versus them, and Dave, Chief Hall brought up that one of the big things that's come out is the lack of a unified command. We don't want the we versus them. If you've taken any of the operational level active shooter courses, as I see some people on the attendance list, like Joe Saunders, some people like that have taken them. It is a task force. It's not a strike force of just cops and just firefighters. It's a mix. It's a task force. You have someone in there protecting the EMS and the firefighters as they're going in to either do body recovery or do that rapid treatment thing. Look at what other resources you have. What do your mutual aid partners bring to the table? What kind of transportation? Can you use a school bus for mass evacuations? Chief McGee brought up about the importance of rapid treatment and rapid transport. Remember that we used to have the old triage, treatment, transport. With an active shooter, you don't spend a lot of time triaging. You shot, you gone. It's the way it is. There's no, and like studies have shown that many of the victims of the music festival in Las Vegas would have survived if stop the bleed protocols would have been rapidly implemented. Do you have things like tourniquets? Ballistic bandages, things like that. You can buy them cheaply in military surplus things, but do you store these in backup locations? Do you have backup supplies? All those look into that and factor into your risk management plan. Next slide. When you gather your intelligence, both Chief Hall and Chief McGee talked about getting information and working together with task forces. You know, do you have relationships with your local police? Do you have relationships with your state authorities? You know, everyone. I see there's a gentleman on the thing who's a fire marshal. Do you work with them? You can use them as resources. And who are your community stakeholders? The schools, the resource officers, both public and private, colleges and universities, churches, government officials. Make sure you build your team and that there's open lines of communication. It doesn't do any good if credible information comes in and it goes into a silo and it never goes out until after the incident. You've got to do that. And the IAFC toolkit and NFPA 3000 stresses the need for communication. You got to maintain and sustain those relationships. There's got to be the ongoing communication. Next slide. Again, prevention and preparedness training. Have a process in place to determine the credibility of information. Do you use a fusion center? Does it require two people to corroborate? Does it require law enforcement corroboration? Are you monitoring social media? Deal with tangibles. You know, there's so much, I call it social media diarrhea out there. People often react to that, but you've got to be able to sort the wheat from the chaff. The more specific information that's posted on that, for example, I'm going to go crazy. Well, that's pretty vague. But if it says I'm going to take a gun and I'm going to go to the high school football game and everybody's going to pay for teasing me, that's specific and you need to take that seriously. Again, as Chief McGee pointed out, our goal is to stop these events before they happen. We don't want to get into the response mode. We want to get into the prevention and the threat mitigation. And you got to be willing to share information. It's not your information, it's your community's information. Be willing to share it. Next slide. In order to do this, you got to train. Next slide. You got to make sure that you're conducting trainings, you can do everything from tabletop exercises to communications to make sure that cops can talk to firefighters can talk to EMS can talk to cops. You might want to do tactical exercises. You might want to do, as I've been a participant in, many large scale, full scale exercises. just to prepare. But you've got to come up with some kind of training program. This program right here is an awareness level training, and it's a start. Next slide. There's a lot of training mistakes that are done. One of the big ones is a prolonged shootout. Statistics show that the average law enforcement engagement with an active shooter is less than 30 seconds. If you're going to have a gun battle, save that for the paintball time. Crowds of active shooter training, but you start announcing that you're doing an active shooter training and you're going to get media showing up. You're going to get members of the community. And what happens is they become a distractor to responders, and you get those people who are looking for the Academy Award as opposed to those people trying to learn from the training. So you want to make sure it's as realistic as possible. You want to make sure that you have plenty of equipment for training the rescue task force. Make sure you have plenty of bandages they can practice with, you know, all the other different things. Make sure they can practice with tourniquets, get training things. You can use mannequins for demonstrating how to put a tourniquet on, all kinds of things. Another big training mistake is no crisis actors with moulage. You can partner with a local college or university or a high school drama thing that has makeup and paint your victims up. They need to see the realism of blood. Your people, when they kneel down beside a body, need to probably kneel down in some kind of simulated blood. They need to understand that these are graphic events, and you have to put that little bit of emotional and psychological fear factor into the response training. Next slide. Another one is lots of downtime. You want to keep first responders, we're alpha type personalities. We're pro-social beings. We got to be moving. You don't want them sitting down for 4 hours while the instructors are setting up the scenario. You want to make sure that you don't have active shooter exercise evaluators who are nitpicking every little thing. There is no incident. If you look at Las Vegas, if you look at the Walmart shooting, if you look at the Pulse nightclub shooting, there's nothing that went perfect. There was a whole lot that went right, and that's what you've got to focus on. And the last thing is unrealistic scenarios. If you're in a small community and you have maybe 15 to 1,800 people that attend a high school football game, it's kind of unrealistic to plan a scenario where you have 3,000 victims and 47,000 cars in the parking lot. Keep it real. Work with a church and work with their congregation. Get the numbers. Keep your drill to that size. Same with the school. But you want to try and avoid the training mistakes. You want the training realistic, practical, and applicable. Next. Lastly, we wanted to make sure the panel that developed this training, myself, Chief McGee, Otto, who couldn't be with us today, and others, we wanted to make sure you had a full list of resources. And these resources will be made available to you. They're all credible and vetted. They're outstanding resources. In addition to the NFPA document and the IAFC toolkit, there are lots of resources on toolkits, pamphlets, checklists, posters that you can put up in your community, and things that you can take the message out. We wanted to make sure you had access to these resources. I'm not going to go over them in detail, but they are there for you, and they are available for all of the webinar participants today.
And so, I posted the Rural Domestic Preparedness Consortium and alert web internet links on the chat.
All right, well, thank you all. It looks like we probably just have time for one question. If there are additional questions, I will post my contact information at the end. You can feel free to email me and I'll get those questions out to our panelists. Someone had a question in the audience regarding the term shooters and why this term is used as opposed to another word such as a killer. It says words matter and we shouldn't fall into the trap of media speak. Any takers on that one?
I'm going to jump in on that. I happen to serve on the subcommittee that worked with definitions on the NFPA 3000. I can tell you we spent days working on simply definitions and terms, and every one was debated significantly. Ultimately, the reason for the ASHER terminology is it was the one that we felt like was the most recognized term that most people were familiar with. And again, we had lots of debate no agency, even federal agencies, nobody had standardized definitions. So that was the reason that it ended up going with that, because we felt like as active shooter, hostile event, and whenever you put that together, that can encompass everything from fire as a weapon to shootings to stabbings to vehicle ramming, all of those.
Another issue that came out from that, because I sit on what's called the Council of State Governments Adverse Event Task Force, is some of the active shooters, their intent was not to kill. Some of the active shooters, I think, as Chief Hall will acknowledge, when they were discussing NFPA 3000, they had prior military training, and they were trained that if you wounded a person, it created more havoc and required more resources to deal with a wounded person. So they were shooting in the legs and the hips. If you've ever watched certain war movies, they show that the sniper will try and injure the person to try and draw people out to rescue them as they're yelling for help. That part of that came out of the Dallas, Texas incident, where the shooter was intentionally trying to maim people, and he actually made a statement that he wasn't trying to kill anybody. He was just trying to shoot people and draw people out. Some of these people have some pretty sick and twisted motivations, but I know that Chief Hall's committee struggled long and hard with that term. It was, they sent things out to different committees, and, like he said, active shooters are just a small part of it. Now, the big thing now is vehicle rammings. And just last week, there was a mass stabbing incident where the woman beheaded another woman, in public in France. They're powerful events.
Great, thank you. Well, I think that was probably a perfect question if we could have only had one. That was very interesting information from both of you for that response. So we are at the end of our time together. I will start a conversation on our NBFC members only platform, Volunteer Voices. If you have additional questions or want to join in on the conversation, you can join us there. And here's my contact information. You can jot down my email or phone number if you have additional questions. As I said, you can reach out to me and I will get those to our panelists. I want to thank you all for listening in this afternoon. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you to IAFC for partnering with us on this webinar. As you close your screen, you will have a survey pop up. We'd appreciate your responses. Just to let you know, those are anonymous. So if you do have a specific question, please email me for that. And with that, I will say goodbye. Thank you again, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you all.
Thank you all. God bless and be safe.